Abraham, quiet butt.
It's the Dev Friday Show with Mark and Tim.
That it is. It is the Dev Friday Show. Did you hear that? You're shaking your head. Did you not hear it? Oh no, you're jamming to it, aren't you? That's what's.
Well, I did. I do hear the background music, and I hope it comes through well on the stream, or definitely the podcast when we eventually release it for this episode. But it was a little bit of a delay there, the bumper music got a little bit of a snag there, a little bit of a.
Are you still on your VPN? Is that the issue?
No, I made sure I was not on that this morning. So
all right. Well, you know what? I just realized something, because you can hear me when I have echo cancellation is not on.
Oh, you're going in and out.
Yeah, I'm gonna. I want to do right there. You can still hear me, right?
Yeah, there we go.
So this is on the street. So the audio's fine when we get to that. Like, everyone knows this. When we get to the podcast, it's much better, except for the last one. I just put up last week's, and it has your recorded audio from the stream, since I didn't have the clean audio. But I will drop the clean audio in. Oh yeah. And it'll sound better probably later on today when I re-upload the clean audio. That said. Oh, I wonder if the transcription will be weird because I based it off of that. I have realized that when I hit the cough button on my mic, I can still be heard faintly, as you laughed during the pre-roll there, right? Mm-hmm. That's because of the auto gain control on like Zoom and this, which says, oh, there's some little signal, we're going to boost it, because we think that must be what they're saying. Because my bet is now if I hit the button, you wouldn't hear barely anything at all because the signal would be too low.
Don't leave it up to the AI, Tim. It'll just make choices for you, and then
the AI.
You want to have control. The audio AI, right?
I'm not sure that would be called artificial intelligence, but yeah. So we're a couple minutes late here at starting. About 5 minutes late.
Busy.
Because you were coming off a meeting. What is this?
I know. It's
somebody did you get a new job.
Somebody in academia decided, wouldn't it be smart to have a meeting on 9:00 on a Friday? And I pride myself for not
9:00 on a Friday.
I pride myself for not having to work on a Friday. That's one of the benefits of my job, Tim, is I can teach. I do not have to teach on a Friday. So,
you never pick any classes on a Friday?
No, actually, in our department, either if I teach in the art department or the computer science department, they're primarily Monday through Thursday classes.
Okay. Is that just a department thing?
It's just a department thing. There was occasionally, especially when the COVID thing happened, we had to kind of jump online, and then we had to schedule classes for one semester and kind of make it work within my schedule. There was one semester I did teach a Friday class, like an online synchronous Friday class, and that was kind of, I don't know, I didn't really enjoy that, so try to avoid it now.
All righty.
That's why I want to spend my Fridays with you, Tim. Only you.
That's not a bad goal, I guess.
So yeah, I had a meeting this morning for scheduling. We're talking about scheduling right now because it was about scheduling for the spring semester.
You scheduled a meeting for
started to run a little bit long because we love to talk about our future schedules. I don't know. For me, when they ask me about my schedule, I just copy paste it. I have my schedule already defined. Put the text in chat box. Say I'm done. There it is.
There's the schedule.
No discussion. Here it is.
No.
Yeah.
Well, okay. So you already have your spring schedule planned?
Yeah. So yeah, I'm teaching a full load. I'm teaching teaching mobile development, teaching advanced web tech, teaching my normal advanced web design and 3D classes, interactive design.
How is the object-oriented via? How's that?
I love my object-oriented class, Tim.
Yeah, did you keep all 15 or so?
I'm totally blowing minds.
Really?
Blowing minds open.
That's a good thing then. So
yeah, I haven't had too many people drop out. There was one student who had some personal or technical issues, wasn't submitting assignments, and I was going to just withdraw him because we were allowed to do that the first few weeks.
You can just kick a person.
Actually, it's for financial aid. They actually require us to do this. If the student pretty much does not participate, does not submit anything, barely comes to class, we can just say they're not coming to class, not participating, they just get booted from the class.
Okay.
So I did that for one student, but then he immediately kind of came crying back to me and said, no, I need to don't kick me out, don't kick me out. I was like, oh, whatever. So I was like, all right, you got to get back in my class. You're going to have zeros for everything, and you have to make up this work. So I'm like, whatever, it's on you. So I was like, I just didn't care. But in the object-oriented class, yeah, I was like, for the lecture, I had this great lecture this week. I talked about managing object instances. So that the textbook that I use kind of walked through an example, like this kind of bank accounting example of like, having like an accounting class that gets imported into like a main.py file. And then you basically create multiple objects or instantiate multiple objects from the class, sending it different sets of data so that you can kind of see how data is encapsulated inside the object. So, each object that gets created has its own, set of data and that belongs to it. And so, but I was like, okay, let me take the step further. I made a to-do task manager style application in Python to show them. So it's small. It was basically just, if the whole thing was basically inline within one class that then I just instantiated, but then showed them how to do exception handling within that, how to also do dictionaries too. Which I get so frustrated when I teach these computer science classes, and I teach like either mobile development or object-oriented programming. The students come in not knowing anything about dictionaries.
Now,
and that
being
really
a poor PHP developer, we don't have dictionaries. Everything's just an array, but dictionary you're talking about basically
like a key value list, hash table, like hash list or something like that.
Right. Okay. Or hash. Yeah.
However, when to describe it, I usually call it like a key value array in a sense. That's what just think of it like that.
So they're not familiar. Like, so they'd come in with the familiarity of an array. I have a set of scalar values.
Yes, barely.
But not the idea of a key leading to a specific value.
Yeah, that's or like an unordered, because that's also what a key value or hash list is, an unordered list that's maintained by, the data is maintained by a key and a key value pair. But they don't come in my classes with any experience with this at all. And I always find it so interesting when I introduce it, because I use it so much in my exercises and my demonstration. Because actually that's where I find it. Also, my preferred way to managing data, like say within a class and do like structure, is basically storing hash objects, dictionaries inside of an array. So having like an ordered array and then storing your key value pairs in sets within the array. So that's what I showed them. That's what I showed them this week. And I was like, it was kind of blowing their minds and kind of get them up to speed. And also I showed them how to if I started to write code that gets that is duplicated like within a class. Let's say like let
me just follow that data structure.
I'm too excited right now. I know.
I know you are. So you're saying like if you have a set of say coordinates, you'd store them in an ordered array. Like say it might be I don't know. Let's say it's the activity of let's say that. Let's say it's a bunch of waypoints that I've plotted on a map. This is where we've recorded, and we're going to show your path, right? Yeah. So you do that in an ordered array, and then each one of the things in the ordered array would be a dictionary that would be lat and long, something like that, right? Now, do you and then now do you though? I was just curious when you started down that approach. Are you saying, in that case, you're saying these are my waypoints? Right. But
correct. So you have like a waypoint array, but then each one of those elements of that array is basically a key value pair or set of key value pairs.
That waypoint array would be something like a property on your object, right? You're not necessarily advocating for an object just has a dictionary that has all the data. It's more okay. Correct. So there are private properties, but then we're going to use dictionaries to store aspects of different collection of data.
Yeah,
Instead of say you could now a much more object oriented. No, I shouldn't say much more. A much more object rich way to do it would say let's describe lat and long in a class.
If you're going or struct, you can do like
or struct. Okay, in Python you can do struct. And store it that way. So why do you go with the dictionary over that? Just
no, because you're right. I would actually prefer what you just said. Go, let's take this let's model the data. Let's take it to the next level. And let's do it in a class or struct and kind of like really do like a data model, right?
Right.
But they're not even there yet. I need to get them to understand just a basic data structure of arrays and dictionaries and how they
jump from dictionary to a struct is not probably a bad jump.
No, you're right. Yes, but it's kind of a couple. It's not, but it's also a couple extra layer, or just an extra layer that you kind of have to understand.
But to take that leap right to struct or right to a class that defines basically a value object might be too much. Okay, I see that.
If you look at from a C or C++, structs are introduced pretty early. If you think about that, like that, but that's why these students, I wish they had experience with structs coming in my class, but it's so rare.
No, all right.
So anyway, so I did this kind of task manager, kind of storing list of tasks. So you have like a task with a name, with a status. So if it's done, completed, open, and just storing that within a dictionary, and then showing how to change the data, kind of in line within the class or within properties defined by class, and also showing them how to refactor, which also blew their mind because they were like starting to get the thing. Okay, if you start writing code that you're going to be basically copy and pasting in different places of your application, would it be appropriate to take that set of code, like a for loop that you're iterating through your array or whatever? Could you just put that into a method or a function and then be able to call that, in multiple places instead of just copy and pasting the code? Because that's the other thing I see.
I want to come back to this. This is really like
introductory
thing.
Students who learn programming just love to copy and paste code and put everywhere, which honestly, I understand. I did it too back in the day.
Oh, really? Really, just copy and paste the same thing? So you're showing him how to refactor out that and say, let's do this with a method.
Yeah,
because that's like, it's seeing the same things. Let's introduce. And it's class.
Funny. I did that because I was like, okay, that's easy. I need to iterate through this data again in this other method. Well, okay, let me just take these 3-4 lines of code. Let me copy it, paste it, put it in there. And I said to him, do you see something wrong with this? Like, and there was only one person in the class out of 14 who actually picked it out. He said, yes, you're repeating the same for loop over. And I was like, yeah, you're right. So let's refactor this. Let's put this into its own method that we can then call. And then I could tell that kind of just like, whoa. They were taken back.
To dry up their code, right?
Yeah.
Now, on the refactor question, and I want to I want to maybe chase this. This might be a good thing for us to talk about. On the refactor question, did you introduce any notion of testing it to prove that the refactor? No, I mean just like at a high level, right? Because you have some to-do list class, right? And I'm guessing if you're maybe you're doing a command line script right now that's saying
it's all basically
spitting out the list.
Yeah, it's basically like a Python command line terminal style application, which I did show them how to do like basic inputs. So basic like requested input, so I could get some, the user could type in some information, do some print messages, and basically just do a text-based kind of UI for it. But then have the user driving the data, because also I wanted to show them how to do exception handling. So if the user doesn't enter in the correct data that you're anticipating, how to handle that appropriately. Yeah.
So I'm just wondering if there would be.
So what were you saying about the testing
level,
part?
Yeah, say could we instantiate the object that you're attaching to the command line, and then put in 2 or 3 tasks, and then look at the output and say, well, the expectation of this output is this. This output should just be this, and like 3 lines, right? It's just 3 lines of text. And could we somehow have a simple Python script that just did that and said, oh yeah, if I input, first task, second task, third task, my expectation is, and I don't know if yours is first in, first out, maybe my expectation is when I say list it, it's third task, second task, first task. And just a simple script that does that, then you can go in and say, now we're going to refactor it, and we've copy pasted this for loop a couple different places. We're going to put that in a function or a method, and we're going to break it, right? And then we're going to run our test and be like, oh, it's broken, and then start them down that path of saying, how else would you outside of this automated test, you would have had to go to the command line again and type and see, okay, yeah, I'm going to test to make sure I didn't break it. But if we have this one little script here, we have so much more freedom to say, let's refactor this, let's refactor that. Does it still work? Well, I know at a minimum I can shove tasks in, I can get them out. That's the whole point of this class. So even without having to go down the road of what's the Python testing framework, let's set that up and figure out, you want to arrange, you want to act, you want to assert. This is what unit testing is. This is what this testing. Instead of all that, just say,
oh man, if I threw inserts in this class, that would not go anywhere.
What if we just put a script together that did these 3 things, and we could then call it a test and just plant that seed of, wouldn't it be nice?
No, you're right. And I do. That's why I start, before we even start talking about doing like a user interface and requesting input for the user. That was basically how I showed them how a class works and how the methods and properties can be set, how the behaviors work and how the properties can be utilized just by writing some test code. So basically you instantiate your object, and then you write some test code using that object below that, and then you just run it and then see the output. So that's what we're doing. But you're right. Like if I would have had some test code along the side of the user interface, and then to kind of show them, how that we could use the test code in addition to having the user test it, that would,
yeah. So that just seems, when you talk about refactoring, to me, like, oh, test coverage makes it so nice. And that's actually a couple weeks ago we were talking about that in our team, was taking the bounds of our tests and just making them a little bit bigger. So if we can. So the refactor path is simpler because we don't have to change a test that maybe broke because our refactor changed what we were testing. Instead, if our bounds of our tests are just a little bit bigger, but not outside how we use this thing. So you just saying, let's imagine a bigger unit, because if the interplay between this class and another class, or these three classes, or however we have it, if they're really only used in conjunction, if from a who's going to use this code and the code that's going to call this code, if it's only ever used together, then if we test it together, we say that's the bound of our unit. Now we can change the way they interact, and our tests don't have to change because they just tested the output of them working. Now, some would call that an integration test. I would argue it's not an integration test. Martin Fowler has a good article on terminology with testing and how people call integration tests if it's more than two classes, and he's like, maybe call it a social unit test, because to him, integration test is when you're integrating with a system that is not yours. And I totally like that's the terminology I embrace, is integration tester when I'm testing against something that I don't own at all. It's something that is external to my code completely. But if I'm just testing the orchestration of a couple classes together, especially when those classes only are used together, yeah, setting the test bounds to what that unit would be makes my refactor path a whole lot easier. And I think that's where people get frustrated at unit tests, is because, oh, I'm going to go and change the way this code works, and I'm going to have to go and change these three tests too. But no, if your test bounds are like that to-do list example, right? If your test bounds are, I shoved in 3 to-dos, and when I asked what my to-dos are, I got out exactly what I expected. Now, does it matter if those to-dos are stored in a array that then stores a dictionary? Or if it's an array that stores a struct, or what if it's an array that stores a value object that's a class?
So you're saying to bound it to the like the kind of the raw results, not caring too much about the types that are coming out?
In your case, yes. But in any case, I'm just arguing for this thought of, are these classes ever used? Is it, what is the actual unit that is useful and valuable to test? And then testing that so we are free to refactor without worrying about breaking tests that are simply testing. And I'll talk about this when I do, talk about testing. It's easy to see it in a method when you're testing a method on a class, because a lot of times we think of test as a unit test tests a class, and maybe it'll test all the methods on that class. Okay. It's a little bit easier to wrap your mind around this notion when you're looking at a method, and I'll say things like, I don't want to test how it's done. I want to test that it's done.
Yeah.
In other words, I don't care if it doesn't matter what order these things happen in. Why wouldn't the test, would I say, well, expect this call first and this call second? Because I could just flip those 2 lines in my code and the test would fail, but it would still work, because it doesn't matter what order you do this thing. Unless it does. Then I should totally test that it does it in the right order, because that's what I'm testing. I'm testing that it calls this service first and then it calls that service. So I tend to encourage this. Don't test how it's done. Figure out what we're trying to test and test that it's done. But then at a higher level, if you just have, like I said, 3 or 4 classes, because you've broken things up very nicely in isolation, but they're only ever used together. If we start unit testing each class, we are essentially testing how it's done. And at a bigger picture, we really want to test that it's done. And do these classes together encompass, like if you're saying, I have this thing that inputs to do, from the user, does things with it, and then when you ask it these questions, it spits out the right data. Okay, if you store it using value objects, do you have to test the value object? If it's a value object that your class only consumes itself, probably not, because you don't care. What you care about is, will the code calling this to-do list repository, which is essentially what you're describing, right? It's going to store a bunch of data in memory. Does the code that calls it, is it going to get the right response? If it does, I don't care how many classes it uses behind the scene. I don't have to test each interaction there. Just test the whole.
I really like the idea, and this is getting me thinking too, because in the spring I'm scheduled to teach a course called Advanced Web Technologies, which the last time I taught this, I didn't teach this last year, but I taught it probably about 2 years ago.
I just want to poke fun of that. Advanced Web Technologies.
Okay, I know. I didn't create the name of the course.
What is advanced web? I mean,
it's advanced, Tim.
I'm a simple web
developer.
this
course is meant to be like what's called a capstone course.
Ooh.
In academia, which is meant to basically be a final course within the program that the students are basically to review and also apply what they've learned, and take it in more advanced ways.
Right. And isn't it? Those are the types of courses that the student is expected to have some type of project that's pretty much self-directed, not
it can be
depending.
Correct. It can be. If you're talking more like a seminar style or like an independent study course, that could probably be along that lines. But the way this is designed is basically to, the students coming into this course have taken client-side scripting, they've taken server-side scripting, they've taken their database management course, they've taken all their higher level programming course.
Gotcha.
While they may be also taking a couple of those while they're taking this course too, but it's meant to be done in the final semester of the program. And the way that I taught this last time was like, okay, I want to approach this course from a very professional standpoint. Because one thing that frustrates me when I got into the industry, and also when I see people come into like entry level jobs, is that what they learn in the classroom doesn't really apply to what they're doing on the job. Right? They're not using the same tools, the same methodologies. They're just like, they may have some good fundamentals about programming, like how like I talk about a lot, just doing like whatever, good patterns, good fundamentals, but they don't have any good, they're not using good tools, not using good approaches. So the way that I taught that is, okay, let's design an application that is let's say a static, primarily JavaScript front-end UI application that then uses an API along with the database, and to kind of show them kind of like all these pieces and how they kind of fit together. Getting the students to understand APIs was tough. Just to kind of, because they're taught from a server side perspective of saying it kind of PHP inline, rendering it on the server, and then sending it back out.
Inline?
Yes. So
stop this crazy.
I don't teach that course, so I'm taking responsibility of that. But
what do I have to do to talk to that?
So I'm thinking about
for a couple minutes.
So what I'm thinking is like, okay, what you're talking about from a testing perspective is kind of interesting, because, and maybe you can give me some suggestions how I should do this, because if I do the same thing, which I do kind of want to still talk about APIs, be very JavaScript for the UI and PHP for the backend, because that's what they should know coming into this course. But then show them how to write the server-side PHP code from a testing perspective. But also, like I said, once again, just like with APIs, it's a whole extra technical layer that they have to start having wrap their heads around. And even when I got them into like Postman, show them Postman, which I think is a cool application about how you can start to write your code, immediately start to test your API code and your calls within Postman without you having to worry about the front end. And that's how we did it. We basically said, okay, let's just worry about our gets, our posts, seeing what the data that's returned, just also learning about JSON and just knowing how we can get the structures back from our calls. And so then once we understand the data and understand the API part of it, then we can start designing the front end. So that's the way that I did it last semester. But then to add in testing on top of that would be kind of interesting. But also I'm kind of worried about, will it be something like a whole thing? It'll just be, I'll kind of lose them. You know what I mean? So what would you suggest for a PHP kind of a simple approach for, let's say, writing a very simple API but doing it from a testing first approach?
All right. So a couple things. And how long do you have these people for?
Only like three months, like three or 4 months.
That's fine. It's because a couple things come to mind. One, and this is going to sound completely self-serving.
The class about a 2 hour week, about 4 hour. We meet 4 hours a week, and then it's twice a week.
So two
hours. 2 hours. Yeah, 2 hour sessions
every week. You said you have them for a couple months, 3 months.
Yeah, 3 months. Yeah.
Okay. The first thing is, and like I said, this is going to sound self-serving. I give a talk on PSR 15 and PSR 7, which if you're not a PHP developer, those are meaningless. But if you are a PHP developer, they still may be meaningless to you. But if you want to be a really good PHP developer, you should know what those are. Because the PSRs are the PHP standard recommendations. In other words, a bunch of frameworks, PHP frameworks, and representatives from those frameworks got together and said, this is crazy sauce. we all have our own way of doing things. There are some things that we should try to unify. And the first PSRs were just unifying around auto loading and code standards. The first couple, we're like, how can we standardize auto loading so it all happens the same way, and namespaces and where we put our files. So, you're not doing underscores and I'm doing namespaces, and let's standardize that so frameworks could all work the same way, right? As they go down, we have a PSR for logging, which said, hey, you could have your logger, I could have my logger. Why don't we have an interface so it doesn't really matter as long as I take a PSR logger, I can use your logger, I can use my logger. Those loggers can have great features because maybe your logger binds right to a bug snag or a logly or some type of technology that or does syslog, but we can all share the same interface.
Who in this? Sorry, distracted him, but I do have to have a beef about probably somebody within this PSR.
Oh, no.
Who came up with the whole backslash thing for namespacing in PHP, for packaging and namespacing? That's ugly.
I don't know. That's the I don't know who did that for the namespaces. That's because that's a language thing.
Oh, so what you're talking is totally different from that.
I'm not talking about the language. No, this is.
You're talking about
userland.
For the frameworks, the libraries, so
right. These are framework and library authors.
So my beef is with the PHP language in general.
Okay. Yes, but everybody has a beef with PHP, the PHP language in general, and
it's supposed to be the backslash. Once I saw that, when that was implemented, I can't remember what you remember what version that was in for the namespacing.
You were like, I'm going back to C#.
Well, yeah, because I was raised on C# and Java, so I was like, it's like the dots. You use dots, and then you and I know that you can't use dots because of the concatenation thing with PHP. Just with your arrow rockets or the arrows you do. With
arrow rockets, I like it. I don't even know what I'm supposed to call them. Honestly, I'm a PHP developer, right? Like I should know what to call them.
I'm just making up stuff now.
I don't know what to call them. I like rockets. Yeah, because it'd be well, you take the user variable,
I know it came from Perl.
Make.
That's why.
User rocket. Anyway.
No, there actually is. What was that? There's a what language was that? Was doing that? Was that Swift? Or some language
so digressive.
That does it does like the rocket symbol. It's like you do the equal sign and like a right angle bracket.
Yeah, well, PHP does that too for array.
For an array. Oh, that's right. Yes.
Yeah.
So long as array. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Or a dictionary.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I was honestly, I got used to the whole arrows for calling methods on objects. That was fun. I got used to that. Even I prefer the dot. But once they lost me at the backslash.
They lost you at the backslash.
I couldn't take that.
Nobody even uses like that's the IDE handles all that. You just import it, puts it at the top. We don't even. I don't. Hey,
I'm on Vim, Tim. Everything's manual.
Yeah, well, that's the first thing to teach your students not to do. It's like let's get a proper.
That was interesting too.
Let's get a proper IDE.
Oh, yeah. So I think so I've been using Replit a lot, which I love Replit. Let me give a shout out to Replit as like a learning tool.
Not a sponsor, could be a sponsor.
I love Replit for a learning tool. If I try to use it for real projects, it starts to break down. But
you think?
But I love it as a collaborative kind of educational space. Oh, it's like once I switched over that for all my web design and web development courses, because I hated dealing with the setup. Teaching somebody how to get MAMP or WAMP or XAMPP or whatever, all these like development kind of, stacks you got to get running, getting MySQL installed or whatever, and then just understanding how to run a development environment, right, was always such a painful process. And every time I did it, I felt like I'm just wasting time. Because like, this isn't really the point of the class. Like the point of the class is we got to get to actually building something, right? So once I moved to Replit, then I was like, it takes care of all that. I don't have to worry about that. The students just go log in the IDE, and they kind of just type the code, hit the run button, runs, and then we could share projects. I could go into their project, edit their code. I love it.
Yeah.
So anyway, the whole reason to bring this up, I was doing it. I was doing my code editing really super fast, and then copying, pasting. You don't know this in Vim. How you can do like the keystrokes. You can select your block. Yeah. You can go into your visual mode and select your block, and then do like you grab it and then put it somewhere else, right?
And I did. For yank or G for grab, or
Yep. So I was doing it real fast. I wasn't thinking about it because honestly, I code much faster. So I'm doing that in class, and one student asked me, "How did you do the copy paste?" And I was like, and I thought about it for a minute. I was like, well, okay.
Gather around.
I'll show you how I turn this mode. I was like, I'll show you how I turn this mode on in Replit, which is in the settings, but don't do it because you're not going to.
You'll never know how to quit.
And I said, like, I don't have enough time to explain it right now. I thought in my head, I'm like, actually, I don't know if I could actually teach somebody Vim because like I just know it. I don't even just it's just a pattern to me now. So it's like,
yeah, it's all muscle memory. Yeah.
so sorry to distract you, but that was something else that happened this week.
We are so I don't even know what this like. I had a topic kind of.
They started making fun of PHP. I love it.
It's changed, but where were we? Oh, the PSRs. Yeah, because you're
PSR. Yeah.
Back to this question. If we can backtrack this conversation a little bit, how to get new developers, new PHP developers? You're telling them they should build an API, and how do we do that in PHP? And then maybe shim in a little bit of testing. So, and I
keep
started
it
going
as
down this
simple
road
as possible. Lightweight.
I started going down this road of the PSRs. So the PSRs are just recommendations that frameworks said, hey, here's interfaces that we're going to agree upon, so you can use our code interchangeably. And the PSR and Composer, in my opinion, the introduction of the PSRs and the introduction of Composer as the kind of de facto PHP package manager are two of the most important things that have happened to PHP in the past 10 years and are perhaps what has kept the language as relevant as it is. In addition to all the, I don't want to undersell the changes to the language that 7 introduced and now 8 introduces that are so good, but like without those things, from a practical standpoint, I don't know where PHP would be. So that said, PSR 7 is an interface that describes how you should see HTTP requests and responses. And provides the interface doesn't provide this, but any implementation of it usually provides a way to say, oh, take the super globals in PHP and then wrangle that into a request object. So now we have something that represents an inbound request, and should we want to send a response down, whatever PSR 7 implementation we're using has a way to create that response object, say, oh, set this header, it's going to be JSON encoded, or it's, the content type is going to be JSON XML, right? Or JSON, yeah, what am I saying? Application/JSON. And then, structure the body to be this. So instead of echo that to output it or whatever we're going to do, we're going to use templates or a template library. I can craft these request and response objects and then work on them. So that's what PSR 7 gives us. It gives us proper representations of request and response, which, and you're saying, I want to build an API. I'm like, boom, that's it, right? You don't have to know which library you're going to use for that. You just have to know, oh, I'm going to start communicating in this, I'm going to treat things as a request or response object, and I'm going to use that interface because what you do with it is relatively the same, no matter what I'm going to say, oh, I want it with a header or I want it with this body.
So I'm looking at this, and if for those of you listening to this and never heard of this before,
this is never good. This is
I'm going to the website php-fig.org.
Yeah, the framework
that's listing all of the standards. So is there a standard for testing?
No, we're not going to get there at all.
Okay.
But I'm going to show you how you're going to get there.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
This is what PSR 7 introduced these request and response objects.
Yep.
PSR 15 introduced the notion of middleware, which is the most simplistic way you can think of to handle a request. There are two interfaces there, and I say this is self-serving because I give what I believe is a very good talk on these two things. And show it's a hands-on, let me show you the code. We're going to actually fire requests, get response, and just see how useful these things are. And I'm only going to talk about the interfaces. We'll use an implementation in the class, but I'm not going to in the talk or the training or whatever you want to call it. But it doesn't matter because I'm just using the methods of the interfaces anyway. So it would work with any implementation of PSR 7 and 15. PSR 15 introduces two interfaces. One is the request handler, which from a web development perspective is simplistic. You give me a request, I give you a response. That's it. Like that is what an API does, right? And then the middleware interface, which says you give me a request and you give me a next handler and I will give you a response. And that interface there unlocks so much because now you're saying the thing that implements that interface can inspect the request, can potentially pass it on to the next handler, Or it can say, I don't even want to pass it on to the next handler. I'm just going to return a response right away. Or it can pass it to the next handler, get the response back, inspect the response, and then manipulate it. So now we have a very easy way to create middleware chains. And in a 45-minute talk, I show how you can build a super simplistic API using these interfaces. You don't have to be like, oh, I learned the whatever framework, even if it's the super simple API framework. You don't even need that because the PSR has like a 30-line boilerplate middleware handler that's just like copy that in, use that as an example. Now all the code you're writing is code you own. You don't have to think of how does the framework do this.
Yeah.
You can just say, I'm going to have a simple index PHP that just passes the request, it wrangles it into a request and passes it to my API middleware, which does all the work. Like I say, 45 minutes, I can show you how to do that. That's how simple this is. And you can walk away saying, oh, I kind of get how that all works. And then when you say, well, how do I test it? Well, the simplest way to inject testing there for someone who is not familiar with testing is to say, well, let's test it holistically maybe. Let's create a request object because I can certainly wrangle the PHP superglobals into a request object and fire that through. Or I could just make the request object myself. And I could say someone calls / whatever with this body. What do I expect to get back? Well, you expect to get back whatever your API response should be, right? Mm-hmm. And I can just have a file there that tests that. And then maybe you could go just a bit further and say, wouldn't it be nice if there was a testing framework that did that for you? Well, let me tell you about PHP Unit. It's the simplest testing framework to get started with. And once it's up and running, we could test your whole API by exercising all of your middleware, or you could take an individual handler and say, let's test the handler. Let's give it a request and see what it gives us back. And we can test in isolation if there's benefit to that. Okay. But at a high level, you could just say, I don't need to use Postman to make the request. I can just create a new test.php, create a request that looks the way I think it should look, and then just inspect the response and say, does this equal this? If not, I mean, it's not a test. It's not in a testing framework, but it's a test.
It becomes more automated then. So you show them a more streamlined approach without having to go to a third party for.
Right. You can write a simple test.php that does this work for you, or you could say, hey, you know what? There's this thing called PHP Unit that will make it really easy to structure multiple tests like this and tell you which failed and why they failed and all that kind of fun stuff. But if you've got them for 3 months and they should already know PHP, and this is a capstone project where the desire is to show them what industry's actually doing. I don't think they've ever seen an interface before, though. So I'm gonna have to what are they learning in their PHP class? No, I don't think they even use like classes in PHP. Yeah, they just use a purely just straight function, like procedural. And there's no reason to be teaching these people PHP. I'm gonna be real honest, real quick right here. I love telling you because you lose your mind, whatever. Because if the goal is to say that PHP runs like 78% of the internet. So industry wants PHP developers, and the thing we're teaching them is how to do PHP 20 years ago. That's right. It's a standard, Tim. It's like you said, it runs like 70% of the internet based on that standard. No one should be doing PHP that way anymore. Oh my. Well, okay, I do like you introduce this because also I was thinking about this week too, and because of teaching and also just me starting to get back into projects and start to work on things again. The older I get, and I wanted to ask your opinion about this too, and maybe your experience working with other developers, the less I want to use frameworks. And I don't mind using libraries here or there, but the less we talked about this before about how framework versus libraries and component library over frameworks, yeah. But even so, relying on a set of code that other people maintain, develop, and that let's say you're not really keeping up with that library and the development of that and the issues that come up and how the bugs or whatever, or the upgrade chains that could happen and that how that also affects dependencies that the library or framework may have. But the older I get, it feels like the more that I do this, I kind of want to use frameworks, even some libraries, less and less because of the dependency that your projects kind of get built on, especially if it's a project that you're chipping away at for a long time, which that seems to be me. I have all these projects that I'll start last year and I'll pick it up a year from now and I'll start doing it. And then we're like, okay, I'll see what's changed on that library that I was using or that framework that I was using. I do the upgrade and that breaks everything.
and then I'm like spending a good amount of time figuring what broke or how can I get this running again, when I'm should just be, let me go back to trying to solve the problem that I was trying to solve with this project. But if I just did it without that dependency, so like trying to limit my dependencies and staying away from dependency hell, it's kind of like, I feel like I'm just, because every time I resume a project, I feel like I'm always faced with a stupid thing like this, because software changes and upgrades, and they should, like framework should. I totally understand that. But then if you provide a big reliance on that within your projects, it can also become a huge pain. So I'm just kind of curious from your experience, even with your company, like do you pick, like, let's say if you're going to be using, because you talked about the next evolution of the Zen framework that you guys use, the Laminos, yeah, sorry to the L. So do you pick, like, okay, so if we're going to use this library or these components, do you kind of limit yourself to like a certain set so that you can kind of limit the dependencies, or do you try to avoid them altogether and just build internally too?
I mean, that's a good question.
Like percentage wise, or like, I don't know.
We're at the state in the application where a lot of the stuff we're doing is tailored towards us. I'll be talking with the team a little bit about that even today. Is as we, we have what is essentially our own framework that is built of component libraries and things like that.
But it's your own code that you maintain, that is not a third party piece that you're bringing in.
Right. It's From our perspective, it's not like we're saying, oh, well, we do it this way because that's how the framework tells us to do it. We have freedom to do it the way that is best for us, and we should try to leverage that to say, well, let's tune it all to what we're actually doing so we can deliver things faster. Not in a unsafe way, but it works for us. So
did the product first start off that way? Or was it relying on a framework? Then it was a natural kind of evolution of.
No, there's never been a framework. We've brought in the component libraries as needed.
Okay.
And as it makes sense. But to that end, it's like I always prefer a component library over a framework, because I don't think that if someone said, well, this is a good generic way to do it, it necessarily means it's a good way to do it in my context, right? Which is why I love the whole notion of the PSRs, because they're just saying these are interfaces to use. So I can write my own middleware stack that works with PSR 15, and I can also say, oh, someone over here has a middleware that does OAuth, OAuth authentication for APIs. I can just bring it in. Now I'll need to wire it up a little bit, but I can bring it in. I can know, well, yep, this dependency, the dependency we have for OAuth is on this component from this library over here. But should something happen with that, we need to upgrade it, or we figure out the dependency's not working. Well, that we could replace that if we wanted, and we could bring in a different. There may be pain bringing in a different library, but we could bring in a different library, or we could own it ourselves, or it's a little bit. It's not like, oh, our framework upgraded, now controllers are done in a completely different way. We need to update all of our controllers.
Yeah.
And that's where we get into, I think, a lot of that pain, where the framework is dictating a lot of change you have to make, as opposed to you looking at a component and saying, well, I'm going to upgrade this component. That means I might need to change things that touch this component, versus I'm upgrading a framework where basically my code fits into their structure, not their structure has been adapted to my code. Then it's like, well, look at all the work I have to do just to stay up to date.
I know and I have a love-hate relationship with this, because I've learned so much by using frameworks, but also from my development time when I got into, let's say, out of college, then into my first job, and then that was kind of either we're using this database kind of language framework for one set of applications, but then I was able to get introduced to .NET and doing ASP.NET development, and that framework taught me so much about structuring code and kind of application development. And then it feels like my brain got kind of wired in that, so I started every other project with a framework in mind and thinking like, oh, what's kind of a good framework for this type of application I want to make, and I'll find one and I'll use it, I'll adapt to it, learn it, and I always like that experience. But then, like I said, the longer you're doing this, just feel like the reliance on that, it just feels like it's so limited, because I do find like spending so much time just maintaining it, or just maintaining the knowledge of what the framework, the state of the framework, the upgrades, the dependencies that that it has, and then making sure it, when the framework gets upgraded, it doesn't break your application. That's also why I got away from CSS framers too. Like Bootstrap, I loved Bootstrap back in the day, right? It solves so much, but then once I started doing some upgrades of Bootstrap, it started breaking my site. And I realized how much time I had to do to just maintain the site because there was this reliance on this huge bulky CSS framework, and now I don't use anything. When it comes to CSS.
So for that too, it really depends on what you're writing. We have from a web development standpoint, we have freedom to say, well, I just have to answer web requests. It's a very open-ended thing, and I can do that with a ton of different technology. I am really happy about the state of, if you can't tell, the state of PHP, and the fact that with some of these standards that the community has adopted, it becomes really easy to do this, because in essence, what you're generally doing as a PHP developer is handling a server request. And these interfaces and standards make it really easy to do that, and then still maintain some extensibility where I can bring in other people's code as needed. So I'm really happy about the state of that. But I say that to say, like, if you're doing mobile development, framework or not, when the hardware, when the operating system level starts changing their SDK, you have to adapt, right? You can't, not everything is probably as forgiving as a platform as, let's use this as an example, is like Windows, where they bend over backwards to allow you to run old applications that were designed for old versions of the operating system that now have SDK or whatever you want to call it, libraries, I forget COM and all the SDK really that you use to interface with the OS. That's all deprecated. But you can still, a lot of times in different Windows versions, right click and be like, run this in compatibility mode with whatever past version of Windows, where we try to make it still work. I feel like that's probably the most forgiving platform to develop on, versus like some mobile platforms.
Mobile development. That's
we just changed it on you.
Yeah, mobile development. That's its own beast, because like I've done both. I've done Android and done iOS development, and I like the platform, the individual platforms, and the uniqueness of them. But it's hard to kind of manage both at the same time. That's why people who specialize just in Android development or iOS development, they kind of just stay in that lane and they specialize that, which they should. But I've tried to walk in both sides, and also because of teaching, I think screws my head up a little bit too, because I have to teach in a very general perspective, all these different technologies to introduce students to. I also have to kind of teach a variety of things. So managing, both Android and iOS development, the frameworks and the libraries and the hardware and the systems and everything, that is different. Why I was drawn to React Native, because why not? Because you do cross-platform. It does the work of managing the platform, and you just write JavaScript, right? But then you're building a dependency on that framework. And then if there's bugs, which there is, or if there's stack traces that you can't figure out, you drive yourself crazy. And it's just, now I'm like, I'm off React Native now. So I'm like, I don't know.
But even with that, you just traded one set of dependencies for another, right?
Yeah, I know.
Because if you're building on Android, and Android's like, guess what? We changed some of this SDK. We're deprecating this in version, 10 or 11 or 12 or whatever. I think they're 13 maybe now. So now you don't have these APIs, not from a web API, but from a hardware OS API. That's gone now. So you have to update your app so you're compatible with the latest version of Android now. So you just trade one set for the other in those contexts.
And now I'm teaching mobile development in the spring, and then I try to teach in a cross-platform way to make it accessible to everybody who's on iOS and Android. That's why I used React Native last time, and it was okay. Students got through it, but they, it was actually cool because I do like the experience. They could see something on the device. Yeah, but now I'm thinking about, honestly, it did also cause some issues with just compatibility wise. So I'm like, maybe I'll just go back to teaching Android. I'll have to learn Kotlin now. I'm like, oh, geez.
Oh, yeah. But, there's a good IDE from JetBrains for that. Anyway.
It's true.
Sure hope so.
Which I do have an educational license.
Language. Yeah. That's right. You got all the free stuff. Yeah.
What do you mean it's kind of their language? I mean, the JetBrains?
Yeah.
They invented Kotlin?
I thought so.
I did not know that. Because I actually don't know much about it.
Mark fact checks me.
Because I'm thinking about, because when I was doing Android, I was doing it with Java. So that's why I haven't done any recent Android development in Kotlin at all. So I was like starting to take a look at it because, see if it's an option. But Because what people have been saying, yeah, you don't want to be, you can still do Android development Java, but you really don't, you shouldn't, because.
So here we go. From the internet. Kotlin is an open source, statically typed programming language that targets the JVM, Android, JavaScript, and native. It's developed by JetBrains.
So it's one language to rule them all.
I guess. I mean,
can I do server-side programming with Kotlin? So if I learn Kotlin, can I do everything that PHP can do? So I don't have to learn another language.
You could do server-side because you would run on the JVM. But I mean I don't know.
And it also compiles down to JavaScript. So can I write front end JavaScript?
I've not seen the JavaScript. So that's interesting to me. I've not seen the JavaScript Kotlin type, but I've not worked with Kotlin. But if you're really going for system level, I mean that's Rust is where it's at now for that. But
no, it's like, that's what I was thinking about today. Was like, or this week was like, the dependencies, and also being a developer is hard because you have to, especially being an unwise developer like myself who tries to embrace so many different things. You just drive yourself crazy. Which I admire you, Tim, because you just stay in that PHP lane and it works out for you. And like, I feel like I keep bouncing my head against the wall, like every year or half a year or every week. I don't know, depending upon what I'm working on. And I just feel like, which I don't know, maybe that's also my mentality too. Like I love learning things.
Yeah, but like I just don't have the time because I aspire to do a lot more embedded stuff, which wouldn't be with PHP at all.
No, but I do admire people that like developers who stay within a kind of a lane of a technology, even though I know you kind of dabble in, done your Arduinos and you're done your whatever, done other platforms.
You done stop, Tim, stop.
But it was like, but I like the fact like you. Over your career of 10 to 20 years, or I guess, not 10 years, more, it's 20 years right now, right? You've been doing PHP?
Wow.
Well, I've been teaching for 10. That's why my head went. But
I don't even know how long I've been doing this.
It's over 20 years, and you primarily just kind of stayed in that lane of PHP. Then it becomes natural to you, just like Vim is to me, right? It feels like a nice, comfortable, warm pillow. I can rest my head on it every night.
There you go. Yeah.
But then trying to maintain all these different kind of languages or frameworks or code spaces, it's like so much to kind of try to manage. And like I said, you become like a jack of none then, right?
Yeah, well then
try to be master of all and jack of none, right?
Then Kotlin maybe for you. You could do everything. You could do Android, you could do server side.
But then when I get in the show with you bring out stuff like this PSR 7 to 17 PHP
15.
standards.
15.
I see 18.
Oh no,
I'm just looking at the.
I was specifically saying though the PSR 7 and 15. Those are the two PSRs that are.
So you talk about this, and I'm like, whoa, PHP is pretty cool. It's like, even though I have my issues with those backslashes.
Well, you never see them. They just import them, and they're fine. Well, I mean, do we have a topic for today?
I know this day was a little bit of a vent show. I know, but I was happy in the beginning talking about object oriented. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, I had a couple. I picked the staying busy because I was going to talk about what's been keeping us busy, but for you apparently it's been meetings about your spring schedule.
Yeah.
But before we get to that, I wanted to talk about just last week. The team sometimes looks at either a book, magazine, something like that, article, and talks about it. And in the current issue of PHP Architect, there is a article on the abstract syntax tree. So the abstract syntax tree, and if you're not a PHP Architect subscriber, maybe you should be, to check out that article. But it reduces, and the author, this is just the first part of, I think, what'll be at least a two-part series on the AST. He uses the example of English language where you might have a paragraph and then a sentence and then a word. And the idea of being able to split that into a tree that says, okay, we've got a paragraph that has 3 sentences. Each sentence has, a couple of different words, and then traversing that tree. So you basically visit each word, but you have the context of everything else that came before you. So you can say, hey, I want to go through and I want to change every proper noun that is Tim to Mark, because I'm going to change the character in my book. And I can identify the node as a proper noun because, hey, it's capitalized. It either starts it. I can look at, does it come before the verb? I can understand that. That's a language perspective. When the abstract syntax tree is applied to a computer language, you start to be able to visit all the nodes in your code and ask questions like, hey, is this an operation? Is this a comparison operator? What are the variables on either side of it? Things like that, which you were talking about refactoring your code. From our perspective, makes it really nice to be able to go through and change things that we need to change before we can upgrade to new versions in the language, because we can iterate over all our code and say, hey, guess what? Everywhere where we do this type of comparison, we can't anymore because that's been deprecated.
So you're talking about writing like a script that would do the searching and do the analysis of your code, do the code replacing for it. Yeah.
Automatically upgrade code based on certain rules.
That makes sense, because I can totally understand this, because if you're going to be writing a language or writing a compiler, this is something you definitely have to think about.
Yeah. And this is something that's new, because it relatively new, because up until recent times, PHP didn't have an abstract syntax tree. Like now I'm forgetting the compiler like lingo. It didn't create one of these in that pass. And
so even the interpreter, so the PHP runtime or the interpreter didn't have that?
It didn't have this, no. Now it does, so we can view programmatically, we can visit and look at our code using tools the same way the compiler would, which is also helpful when enforcing things like code standards, where you might want to say, hey, we never want to compare these two types of variables. Like, for some reason, we just never want to compare them. Or anytime we use this type we use, because PHP, you can say, hey, you can type your arguments to methods. We can do things like, anytime we use this type, the variable name must be this, to enforce some naming convention.
Okay.
Like, hey, we would never use this, say it's the member, and not call it member. So anybody goes in there and calls it like user, no, we're going to call it member, and that's what we're going to go call it going forward. So now we can use the abstract syntax tree and some code around that to say, oh, I'm going to look and see every time there's a variable that's passed to a method that is of this type, and there's no other one of those types passed here, it must be member. Now, if we're passing two, then obviously they can't both be called member. You're doing something with two different members, so you want a different name to tell you, this is the member one, and this is what we're going to change, or this is the relation, or whatever. But we can enforce those at a much better way, because we can navigate the code the way the compiler navigates the code. So that, for us, and you're talking about upgrading, or not upgrading, but refactoring, we can actually do whole code-based refactors, and with a high level of confidence that would be very tedious for us to do as developers by hand. We can automate. So I thought that would be an interesting topic.
What does it look like? So I'm assuming is this something like a class, like it's something you could access from a class or an object that you instantiate, and then you can suck in.
There's tools, yeah. There's tools that work with the abstract.
Suck in a file, like say a source code file.
Yep.
And then basically you could get like a structured set of data of that then you could then analyze. Is that how it works?
Something like that. I mean, a lot of the tools use what would be the visitor pattern to say, hey, give me a method or a class and tell me, well, what nodes are you actually interested in? Oh, I'm interested in variables. Okay. I won't tell you about anything other than a variable. And then also give you the context of what it visited up the tree, right? Like, am I in a constructor? Am I in a method? Is my visibility public or private? All that kind of fun stuff.
Is it pretty much GraphQL?
Pretty much GraphQL. Yeah, no, it's not. No, it's not.
Just a joke related to last show.
Yeah. Which you'll have to listen to last show to get that joke. But anyway, so
that's pretty cool.
That came to mind when we were talking about the refactor.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I had, maybe we'll talk about this next week, is I have been cutting things on the laser all week. So laser, 3D printer, all that kind of fun stuff.
Really?
We're doing there's a community thing that we do. The church goes there and we do a puppet show for the kids in a craft forum. And the craft is to make paper bag puppets. So laser cuts out all the little eyes and clothes and hair and all that. And 3D printer I use to cobble together some fiberglass rods to make a little photo booth that we can. It looks like a little puppet stage that we can put over top and get pictures of the puppets. And,
we could have a discussion, because I did some puppetry back in the day.
You did? That's right. I forgot about that. I did some puppetry. I do a talk on Doctor, and I actually bring a puppet with me as part of the talk. So,
well, it's probably been like 30 years for me, but
yeah, it's been 2 weeks since I last did a puppet show myself. So, because we did the same thing a couple weeks ago for another community event. But now I've been loving the laser, the rapid prototyping stuff. It's amazing.
I like that you keep the puppet heritage going, Tim. I like that.
Yeah, I do my best. I do my best. So, passing it on to another generation as I teach the kids how to also do puppetry correctly, and not like this amateur stuff. But anyway, maybe next week we'll explore. I don't know what we'll explore next week. Who knows? Because we're supposed to have topics, but I feel like
you never know.
I feel like this is the best when we're just off the rails completely.
Yeah. I know. I watched. Maybe I'll save this topic for the other thing. I know. Remember the one thing was about the interviewing thing, about interviewing yourself.
Oh yeah, I didn't even do
that. I saw
that.
a video about what to expect if you're going to try to get an entry level API job. What type of interview questions are good? That's what I was going to interview you. So,
what's an entry level API job though? I don't even know what an API
job
is.
That would be fun to talk about. That's what I'm saying. Like, so I actually go. There's a video I saw on YouTube. This those YouTube channels that deal with like interview prep questions type thing.
Yes.
That came up, and it was an API focused one. I was like, oh, this is Tim's world. So I was like, I watched it, but I got to go back and watch and make some notes, and then I'll interview, and then you can discuss the time when you interviewed yourself and see how those two things align.
That sounds like a good next show.
Yeah.
That I saw a video on that the other day, not on that, but on like one of those interview videos for some reason. It was like about salary negotiation and like talking about what your expected salary requirements were. And the guy was like, well, I've done, this is the answer. You do research, figure out what it is, say that this is the average, high, low, and then shoot somewhere in the middle and say, because, you don't know me, I'd be willing to take this, but I know I'm worth more or something like that. I'm like, I don't know. The rule I remember is you go first. What are you willing to pay? The first person to say a number is wrong, guys. That's like, I don't know. That's the advice I always knew. You just kind of stare at each other until somebody utters a number, and then you work from there. Well, I don't know. I don't know what your technique is, but
I don't know. But we'll see if I don't know. It's interesting those videos coming on with the news about like what Google and Facebook laying off 10%. So
are they really?
Yep, they're quietly doing it. That's what they're not being public about it, but it's starting to come out now. And Google's actually kind of encouraged. No, was it Meta or Google? I think it was Google. Actually, it is Google. They're recommending certain employees to start looking for work.
Whoa!
So they're just trying to nudge them, saying, okay, you might want to start to see what other options are out there. So.
That's never a fun conversation.
So it came up I was watching CNBC one morning, so it's slowly starting to kind of leak out that like. Yeah.
I can see that. We should probably turn the street off like this, but I can see that. It's like, hey, Mark, it's your weekly 1-to-1 with me. Just out of curiosity, when was the last time you updated your resume?
Exactly.
like I noticed on LinkedIn you're not very active. Perhaps you should be.
Yeah.
Do you have any friends on LinkedIn? Quick question. Do you know anybody who's looking to hire? I'm asking for a friend and maybe you.
Yeah, the manager's like, well, yeah. It's like I just freshened up my resume. How about you?
Exactly. Here's some blog posts that have been going around the office. It's all like how to update your resume when you work for Google. Oh wow!
So we'll see how the next year goes. Yeah. So
well, this bonus content you only get if you watch